of the board of directors, the staff, the volunteers, and the members of the Lawrence County Museum to welcome you tonight. In fact, I always like to make a show of acknowledging our wonderful volunteers. If we didn't have the volunteers that we have, we would have no museum, and we would certainly have no programs. So if you are a museum volunteer in any way, from home or on the premises, please stand up. Thank you so much for everything that you do for us. Now, I have the honor of being the president of the board. I don't normally introduce myself as such, but you can see what a big job I have. So if you are interested in serving on the board and being our next president, you know what you're going to have to do. So, again, thank you for being here. Are there any new people who have never been to our museum before? Oh, well, welcome. I hope you'll come back and you can enjoy our exhibits. We may have them open for a short time after the lecture tonight. It just depends on how long he talks, I suppose. Oh, okay. Well, I'll leave that to you. I would be remiss if I did not encourage everyone to become members of the museum if you are not already a museum, and to re-up your membership, because that's how we do what we do here. I don't know if you know this, but our exhibits are free to anyone who comes in. We don't charge an admission fee, and that's so that we can make it available to everyone possible. So, thinking about exhibits, if you haven't seen our quilt exhibit, it's fabulous. And I don't think that I'm being snooty about that. I think it is. It's fabulous. But the problem is that most of it is going to go away by the end of next week. So if you want to see it in its entirety, please come next week. We're open every day, Tuesday through Saturday, 10 till 3. And if you absolutely need a private tour, somebody can probably be persuaded. Before we get to our main event, I just want to highlight a couple things that are coming up. Next Tuesday, Durant Ashmore will be presenting a lecture on the Lawrence County battles of Fort Williams. He says that this is the most contested site in the American Revolution, and I would agree with him just from what he's taught me about it. On September 16th through 18th, which is a Monday through Wednesday, the South Carolina Federations of Museums is having their conference, their yearly conference here at the Lawrence County Museum, and it sounds like it's going to be very interesting. If you're interested in it, call us or look on their website and see what's going on. Also, on Tuesday, September the 24th, Robert Riles is presenting a lecture, and according to Durant, it's going to be quite something. He does some portrayal of an, what did you call it? A Revolutionary War preacher, a Covenanter, and he evidently plays the part full on. So please come and see that on September the 24th. Please remember to silence your cell phones, and would you like them to hold questions to the end, or how do you like to do this? Okay, so please hold your questions to the end of the lecture. Also, at the end of the lecture, Herb Coddington, can you wave, Herb? I think I saw you earlier. Herb, there he is, back there, is going to make you an offer that you might not want to refuse to. So I would introduce Mr. Potter to you, but evidently you know who he is and what he's coming here for, so I won't waste a lot of time with that, except for to ask you, are there any Adairs or descendants in the crowd? Raise your hand. Oh, look at that. Okay. Wow. Well, thank you, and welcome to the pulpit.
Well, thank you. I can't believe all the hands that went up. Can I ask how many are descended from James Adair Sr.?
The original James? The original James?
A few, yeah. And how many are, I guess the rest are descended from Joseph Adair Sr. You know, those were brothers who were born in the very early 1700s in Ireland and came first to Pennsylvania and then they came here. Is there anybody here that's descended from William Adair, who lived in Chester County? We tested the DNA of 2 descendants of William Adair because, I don't know if you're familiar with the James Barnett Adair book that talks about our ancestors. It's a wonderful resource, I think. But he made some mistakes in the early generations, and it's reasonable because he wrote the book, I guess, in like 1920 something, and he's relying on the memory of other people. So some of the early generations were not exactly right. One of the things he said that William, thank you for that. William, I'm not used to this. He said that William was a brother of Joseph Sr. and James Sr. I'll show you some DNA results. We discovered that William was actually a cousin, and we'll talk about that. Let me just say first, some of the things I'm going to talk about, if I don't say this up front, you might get the wrong impression. I am a patriot. I love my country. I served in the Air Force for 22 years, and then I served as a civilian employee of the government for 20 years. So 42 years altogether. I did that because I love my country. My father served in the Air Force for 20 years, and that's where I learned to love my country. My wife, Lois, her father served for 30 years in the Air Force, and so we both have a real sense of patriotism about us. Why am I saying that? I'm saying that because nations are like individuals. People are flawed. Everybody makes mistakes, and you look back into your history, and you might wish that you hadn't done this or that. And nations are the same way. We've got some things that we did in the past that we might say, well, we wish that we hadn't done that as a nation. But even so, I'm very proud of our country. I went to high school in Germany. When I was in the Air Force, I was stationed at the embassy in Moscow. I learned to speak Russian. I've seen other countries, and we really do have the best country in the world. I'm proud of it. But some of the things we're going to talk about, there's some history that's not the best. So I want to also say, I'll talk a little bit about language because I love foreign languages. And in our research, the foreign language related to the Cherokee language and the Chickasaw language was very important for us being able to understand the relationships between the various people and what they were doing back in those days. So I want to start off with a word, chokma. By the way, my granddaughter, when she comes over to our house, we have 9 grandchildren here. I get confused. And when the youngest one, when she comes over, she'll say chokma to me, which is like the short form of this, means hi. And then when we drop her off at school or she goes home, we'll say chokma. which means I love you in Chickasaw. I love it, and she eats it up too. I'll talk a little bit more about that. So Chinchoma means, are you good? And E is yes. Anchokma means yes, I am good. So we'll start off with that. I'm going to talk about the Chickasaw. When the United States forcibly moved the Chickasaw and the other Native Americans in this part of the country to Oklahoma, there were about 5,000 Chickasaw in the room. Their homeland was in Mississippi. You might say, well, what does that have to do with South Carolina? I'll explain it. 5,000 today, there are about 38,000 Chickasaw living in Oklahoma. And it just so happens that I grew up in the Chickasaw Nation in Oklahoma when I was a kid. And I knew nothing about this history or anything like that. But despite 38,000 Chickasaw, only about 50 people speak Chickasaw fluently. To me, I mean, this is tragic. And the company, Rosetta Stone, if you're interested, I would love for everybody here to get their grandkids and different ones. Buy the Rosetta Stone Chickasaw program. Rosetta Stone has, they have a program where they're trying to preserve endangered languages. And there's a number of languages in the United States, Indian languages, that are endangered. And one of them is the Chickasaw language. And it's very entertaining. These are Chickasaw people that live in Oklahoma that are in the thing. It's like $180. I have a copy of it. I've learned about 4 or 5 words because I'm busy with some other things. But I love it, and I think you might love it too. And that's one of the things that's kind of helped me with my big kids. Okay, next slide. So, I'm assuming everybody's kind of familiar with this story of James Adair, who was the Indian trader. Some people say, other people say, no, he wasn't. Well, he was, and I'm going to explain why. This is a picture of, can y'all see that? So this man and that man are cousins. They're descended from John Adair, and I'll explain that later. Those people do not, I mean, if I saw them, I would not say you guys are Indian. And in fact, the governor of Georgia, this is a delegation that went to Washington, D.C., representing the Cherokee Nation. And around that time, the governor of Georgia sent letters to the superintendent of Indian Affairs and said, I saw these people, they are not Indians. I want you to do some investigating and find out. Well, what happened was, I grew up in Oklahoma. Some of the Indians, you can tell they're Indian. They're dark complected, black hair, brown eyes. Not everybody's like that. And what happens was, an Indian trader back in the 1700s, I'll explain this in a minute, they would marry an Indian girl. I'll explain that. Why? They really had to. I mean, maybe a lot of them wanted to. But they would marry a Cherokee woman or a Chickasaw woman. And it was important that that woman be able to speak English and Cherokee. times they were the daughter of an English trader and a Cherokee woman. John Adair, who was a cousin of our ancestor, and I'll explain it. John Adair married a Cherokee woman named Gahoga. Her father was an English trader. Her mother was a Cherokee. Her mother was the daughter of an English trader and a Cherokee. It goes back like 3 generations before the mother and father were Cherokee. So she was like 1/16 or something Cherokee. She probably didn't look Indian. But to the Cherokee, it doesn't matter because they identified whether you're part of the tribe based on your maternal lineage. And in her case, her mother, they were Indians. But still like 1/16 Indian. So these two men were like grandsons of John Adair and his Cherokee wife, but you can't tell it. And that's, well, we'll talk a little bit about that. I'm already rambling and spending too much time, so. So these are just some bullet points about James Adair, the book that he published. His book is considered to be the most authoritative, most valuable description of the Indian tribes in the southeastern United States. If you study American Indian history and that kind of thing in college, they read his book. So people say, well, how is it possible that somebody that published a book like that is our ancestor and we don't know it? Well, what happened? You guys tell me if I'm trailing off. I'm hard of hearing, so I appreciate it. See, what was I saying? So his book is very well respected now. How is it possible that he was our ancestor and we don't know it? He disappeared after the publication of his book. And people have all kinds of speculations about what happened to him. I'll talk about why that makes perfect sense. I'll give you a clue. Published in 1775. What was happening, and it was published in London. What was happening in 1775?
Revolution.
People aren't going on book tours and all that kind of stuff. Oh, I got to talk about this. So, one of the questions, he spent about half of his book explaining why he thought that the American Indians are descended from the lost tribes of Israel. He went into great detail. And remember, this was published in 1775. A lot of people, they look at his book and they're kind of embarrassed by it. They're like, well, I don't know, why was he doing that? And they talk about Thomas Jefferson. He wrote a letter to John Adams and said, well, his book is good, but you got to kind of overlook this stuff about the Indians being descended from the lost tribes of Israel. A lot of what I'm talking about, it makes sense if you dig into the history. If you're not that familiar with it, it may not make a lot of sense. From the very first contact between Europeans and Native Americans, people were asking, how is it possible that the Native Americans And he created us, and he has expectations for how we should live our lives. How is that possible? It must be that the Native Americans got that information from somewhere in their past. And so they started saying, well, maybe they came from the lost tribes of Israel. Somehow they got here to America. So, I mean, in our book, we talk about the different people who were making that argument. So when James Adair goes and lives with the Cherokee initially, and then he traded with them for 10 years, and then he started trading with the Chickasaw Nation. And when he started learning the Chickasaw language, their word for God is Jehovah. So he's seeing all these things line up, and he's thinking, well, yeah, I think the scholars who are making that argument I think they're right. Now, why would he spend half of his book on that topic? Nobody talks about that. You won't find this if you read a biography. They're kind of embarrassed by it. They don't understand. That was the perspective at that time. But I believe, and I think there's lots of good evidence for it, his wife was Chickasaw when he was writing that book. He has a statement in his book. He says, I'm writing that he's talking about the Chickasaw women who were married to Indian traders and how they were an important part of their lives and they worked together. And he said, I'm sitting beside a Chickasaw woman who's every bit a princess as anyone from Peru or Mexico. I'm probably not quoting it exactly right. It's a beautiful statement. He loved his wife, and she had an important role in his life. The thing that's difficult is he's writing his book about the American Indians. He's not writing about himself. And so you really have to search in his writing to try to get these bits and pieces when he reveals something about his life. So why did Adair think that was an important argument to make? He says in his book that Henry Holmes, Lord Kane, I think it's Lord Keynes, he was a Scottish philosopher at the time, and he made the argument that the American Indians are descended from a separate creation. Now, what are the implications? And this goes back to what I was talking about. I love our country. I love the principles that our country are founded on. We're founded on the principle that all men are created equal, and we're endowed by inalienable rights. So if you say, well, this group of people, they're not equal because they're descended from a different creation, so we can do whatever we want to them. Well, James Adair is hearing that, and he's thinking about his wife and his family. So he had the courage to speak out, and he wrote this book, very powerful book. There's a place in that, I didn't mention in that quote. So James Adair said he's writing it beside his wife. And he says, she bids me to write correctly, or it'll spoil the making of hominy. So they didn't make any hominy in those days. And it'll, I wish I could say it exactly, it'll cause the white women to have a wrong impression of the Indian women. So when you look at James Adair and why he was motivated, why he was writing this, what you realize is that his wife had a role in that. She was encouraging him to write and to explain that the Indians are our brothers and sisters. So that's a big part of James Adair's book. Most of what I'm supposed to be talking about is how we know that he's our ancestor, but I think this is a beautiful part of it. Next. So if we start trying to identify somebody that lived way back in the 1700s with false assumptions, we're not going to make any progress. And that's what I was saying before. A lot of people have false assumptions about James Adair. They think that, well, he published this amazing book. He must have been highly respected and gone on tours and must have made a lot of money. It's not true. So some Indian traders became wealthy from the Indian trade. He did not. And I think there were two reasons why he didn't. One is the governor of South Carolina asked him, when he started trading with the Chickasaw, to broker a treaty with the Choctaw Nation. The Choctaw lived in Louisiana. They were allied to the French. The Chickasaw lived in Mississippi, just up north of where the Choctaw were, and they were allied with the British, 700 miles away. So the relationship between the Chickasaw and the English traders was very, very valuable to the survival of the Chickasaw Nation. Governor Glenn said, would you propose this treaty between the English and the Choctaw? He went out there, one of his first years out there, and he spent I think it's 3 years, 3 seasons, year round. And usually they would go out and they would come back because they were going out taking trade goods and coming back with deer skins. 700 miles, took about 35 days. He was very fit, very athletic. And he commented on seeing some armies getting out and marching around and saying, hey, these people are all fat and kind of like me, criticizing me. But, so he's making this journey year after year. Governor Glenn said, well, if we can entice the Choctaw to make an alliance with us, that's going to be great. They wanted to prevent, the French wanted to come up the Mississippi and connect with the northern Indians. Because the French were active up there, they're active down here, let's connect it. Well, the Chickasaw were in the way. And for quite a few years, the French were attacking the Chickasaw and they almost wiped them out. That's why when the Chickasaw were moved to Oklahoma, there were only 5,000 Chickasaw. So the end of that story is Glenn and the legislature in South Carolina did not reimburse Adair for his expenses. And it was about the equivalent of $200,000. And Indian traders, they would buy their trade goods and maybe on credit or something. They go out, they get the deer skins, they come back, and they pay off their debts and stuff. So it could be lucrative, but if somebody's cheating you out of $200,000, that's not helpful. Then the other thing is, when he started wanting to publish his book, he didn't have the money. He didn't have the money to go to London. He wanted to publish it there. So he took subscriptions for the book. And he took the money that he got from his subscriptions to pay for his journey to England. He this is amazing. I gotta take a minute to tell you. How in the world could he do this? He's kind of, one of the contemporaries described him as a man who was rusticated by 30 years of living in the wilderness. How does he do this? Well, he was successful by persistence. He would go to one person and get an endorsement, and take that endorsement to another person, and then that one to another. His final endorsement was from Benjamin Franklin to the publisher. And you look at the people that gave him endorsements, and you can see what he was doing. He did this over a course of, 7 or 8 years. So this is a misconception. If you look at him and say, well, wait, he went to England and got a publisher, probably made a lot of money. No, when he sold the book, he sold it for copies. And he used the copies to pay, or to give the people who had already given him money for the subscriptions. So he's not making money on that. And then, what I was saying about 1775, the Revolutionary War broke out. So neither England nor the Americans are thinking about books. It wasn't until after the Revolution, James Madison had a copy that he contributed to the Library of Congress. It was one of the books that made up the very first set of books that made up the Library of Congress. Thomas Jefferson had a copy. Like I said, he was corresponding with John Adams about it. Elias Boudinot, you may not have heard of him, but he was a very senior politician. I think he was from New Jersey, in the Continental Congress. A lot of these founders were aware of this book. They appreciated it. But this was after the Revolution, and probably after James Adair was dead. I think what happened was he went there, finally published it, got the book published, came back, and he didn't have anything. The war's breaking out. He got a grant for 200 acres, I think. And then he's, just like everybody else, trying to survive farming and whatnot. But at that point, he's almost 70 years old. So he lived his life in this area. In the early years, this was Cherokee territory. In the later years, as English settlers began to populate the area, he was just one of the people. So because of this mystery, if you go to a biography, all the various biographies about him, they just say, well, he disappeared. We don't know what happened to him. And there are a few people, the local historians like James Barnett Adair, who say, well, he was the brother of Joseph. I think that's what he says. But then you've also got some people that come up with other theories. We address those. We show those. There's one other theory that we have heard, and we talk about that. These are the kind of this is the strategy that we followed. So what we did when we started 30 years ago is we heard these stories, and we asked ourselves, well, is it right? Is James Adair Sr. the Indian trader? Is he our ancestor? How come we don't know? How come we haven't heard any details about that? So we started looking at it from the standpoint of every statement that's made about the relationships of these people. Can we find contemporary documents to either support or refute that statement? And we limited ourselves to the question, who is James Adair? And after 30 years, I'll show the evidence. We found evidence. I have no doubt. Like 10 years ago, I had no doubt. But in the last few years, we found even more that's, I think, very persuasive. But I want to know what you guys think. I was just saying, this is the second time we've given a presentation on our book. We asked people, hey, can we give a presentation? And everybody wants a presentation on somebody that lived in their local area. So we live up in Virginia, and only one organization was interested. And we loved that. But since this is only the second one, I want feedback. And by the way, so in a minute I want to try to quit. I have to go for slides fast. The one thing you can do to help us is write a review on Amazon. If you buy a book from us here, I don't know if, I think you can do it, but it'll say that, it won't say verified purchaser. I don't care. Say something nice about the book. The reason I'm saying that, it sounds very self-serving, but the reason I'm saying is that I think James Adair is really, really important. He was a great man. We can look up to him. We can learn from him. But everybody has this strange idea of who he was. And I think at the end of this, you're going to see that he was our ancestor. Or he was the brother of our ancestor, for you all who are descendants of Joseph Adair Sr. He's family. And the only way that people are going to even know that our book exists is if you write just a sentence or just give us 5 stars. Something, the reason is people won't look at the book. They won't even look at it unless it's got those reviews. Okay. This is one of my favorite topics. Remember I said I like languages? And nobody knows this. Nobody knows this. That's kind of fun. When you discover something that nobody else knows. I love that. So, the Cherokee people, they spoke 3 dialects. Upper Cherokee, Middle Cherokee, and Lower Cherokee. Upper Cherokee and Middle Cherokee were pretty similar. So James Adair just refers to them as upper and lower. Upper Cherokee, you know how you have southern dialects? Do y'all think I have a southern dialect? I said I wasn't going to tell this story, but I went to high school in Germany after growing up in Oklahoma, and my friends there made fun of me because I had a southern accent. And then I came back to college in Birmingham, Alabama, and my friends there referred to me as their Yankee friend. And so I was like, well, who am I? And that was really one of the reasons that I got interested in trying to research my family. Our ancestors, more than the Adairs, a lot of the Hollands and Ramage and Waymans and different ones come from this area. Newman. Okay, so like everybody knows that there's this northern, or there's upper dialect and lower dialect of Cherokee. The upper dialect, when they're speaking, they use an L, and in the southern dialect, they use an R. Okay? So, a number of Asian languages do this too. They can't say L's in some Asian languages. There's a famous comedy where there's some Chinese people in a restaurant singing fra ra 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 ra. And I don't know if that's proper to do, but That was the difference in the Cherokee. They had the upper and lower dialect. So if you go to Oklahoma today, the Cherokee that live there speak the upper dialect. The upper dialect was spoken in all this area, and the lower dialect was spoken here. So in Cherokee, if you go look at a dictionary, whatever, the way Cherokee is spoken in Oklahoma, the word Cherokee is Chalaki, because they can't say the R, Chalaki. But we refer to the Cherokee, and the reason we refer to the Cherokee with an R is because the word that we've inherited into English comes from the lower Cherokee. Now, after the Revolutionary War, the lower Cherokee merged into the upper Cherokee, so nobody speaks lower Cherokee anymore. But James Adair, the question was, and this is what nobody knows but me and now you. The question is, what dialect did James Adair speak? And why does it matter? Well, I'll tell you, he spoke lower Cherokee. If he mentions in his book a whole bunch of Cherokee words, and he talks about this is the word for this and this is the word for that. And they didn't have a standard spelling system in those days. So just by looking at how he spelled the words, you can tell how he was pronouncing the words. And every single word, every single Cherokee word that had an L in it, in the Cherokee that's spoken in Oklahoma, the upper Cherokee, he spelled with an R in that place. And in our book, we have the list of words. It's a whole bunch. There's no question. He spoke lower Cherokee. Now, why does it matter? It matters because an Indian trader learned their language from their wife. So this means that his wife spoke lower Cherokee, which means she came from the area where they spoke lower Cherokee. And the area where they spoke lower Cherokee is right here where we are. And that's important because when people talk about James Adair, they talk about, well, we don't know where he lived, we don't know where he traded, and all that. A lot of people assume that he traded with the Cherokee up in the mountains, up in Tennessee, North Carolina, up in that area. But we can tell that he didn't because he didn't speak that dialect of Cherokee. So, I don't know if you guys love that as much as I do. I think it's important because it helps. One of the things that we're trying to do is pinpoint where did he live? Well, when he was, if you want to know where he lived after he published his book, you should look at where did he live when he was trading. And this whole area, I've said before, it was all Cherokee territory. This area, this bluish area, it's got a 2 on it. That was ceded by the Cherokee Nation to South Carolina in 1755. So before 1755, that was Cherokee territory. And we're right in the middle of it. And James Adair was trading with the Cherokee from 1735 until 1744. So he was trading with them right here. This pink area, the Cherokee retained that up in the quarter of South Carolina until I think it was 1777. And that's where John and Edward Adair lived. I'll explain that. I think we're running out of time. I hope you guys have patience with me, or I'll cut it short. Whatever I have to do. Okay, so the Chickasaw. In 1744, he married his Chickasaw wife. We don't know what happened to his Cherokee wife. Some traders had more than one wife. They had more than one Indian wife. They had an Indian wife and they had a white wife. James Adair was not like that. He had one wife. And we know that from his writings. He condemned people who had more than one wife. He condemned traders who did that. So what happened to his Cherokee wife? There was a smallpox plague that wiped out, they estimate, half of the Cherokee population. And it was right around that time that James Adair married his Chickasaw wife. I think his Cherokee wife and probably his Cherokee children died during that pandemic. Okay, so in 1744, we know he married a Cherokee woman, or Chickasaw woman, and started trading with the Chickasaw. If you look at this map here, you can't see it, but the line goes, this is Charleston, and way up there is it's the area of Tupelo, Mississippi. That's where the Chickasaw lived. It was 700 miles. We know the route that the Indian traders took. And we've got it there. We have it in our book.
And Elvis.
Sorry?
And Elvis. Elvis lived in Tupelo.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And it took about 35 days to get there. The Indian traders would have up to 20 horses that would be carrying trade goods on the way out. And then on the way back, they would be loaded with deer skins. We've got all the details about that. So then you say, well, okay, he married this Chickasaw woman. Does that mean he was living in Mississippi from 1744 until he published his book? No. We trace exactly where he was when. It's too much to get into because I can see I have like 9 minutes. If I should stop in an hour, probably out of respect, I know. But you can see that what he did was he was living in this area when he was trading with the Cherokee. When he started trading with the Chickasaw, he was also living in this area most of the time. Sometimes he was making annual trips, but sometimes he was trading with Chickasaw who lived right here. And this is another thing that there's a book about the Chickasaw that lived in upstate South Carolina, and it refers to them as the guardians of, I can't remember, the frontier or something. What happened was in 1723, the government of South Carolina, they had these great relations with the Chickasaw. And they said, you guys are getting decimated out there. Why don't you come and live here in upstate South Carolina and defend us from the Creek Indians and the others that are kind of attacking our frontier? And the Chickasaw, they didn't want to leave their homeland, but they sent 80 braves with their families, and they came and they lived in upstate South Carolina. Now, the government of South Carolina allocated like 2,000 acres for them to live on, It was around Augusta. The Chickasaw didn't want to do that because they didn't want to settle down and farm and stuff like that. They wanted to continue to live their life. Well, upstate South Carolina was still mostly woods and wild country in 1723. It was Cherokee country, but the Chickasaw had a pretty good relationship with the Cherokee, so they were able to live in upstate South Carolina. And I believe Eleanor was the daughter of one of those families. So they came here. James Adair's Cherokee wife died in 1744. He knew Cherokee and Chickasaw people. Whatever the circumstance, he decided to marry Eleanor. And then the reason that that's essential is because, as I mentioned before, the wife teaches them the language and provides the bridge to the Indian nation. So she's a very important part of the story. This bottom map, if you just go back for a second, the bottom map shows on the map, the map was made in, I don't remember, 1750, something like that. It has Chickasaw written along the river, the Savannah River. So they were along the Savannah River and I believe further to the east where Duncan Creek is. And I have Duncan Creek on it. So I pretty much talked about why the women were so important. When James Adair was making these trips, some of the trips he took her with him because he describes the events along the way. Some of the trips, I know she stayed behind. So they had a home here, probably on Duncan Creek. And in those days, this is wild country. And she stayed here with the children, and he went by himself. And we know that because he describes some of his trips being alone. He specifically says, I made this journey alone, and I made it in this many days. He was proud of how fast he had traveled. Okay, so this is just describing the timeline. I've already talked about that, so I'm not going to go into it. But just to say that he spent some time in Mississippi, but it's a misconception to think he's living out there completely. He's living mostly in this area, and there were white settlers in this area even that early. So he's interacting with people of his own heritage. Let me tell you one good story. So, and I won't get it right. He's making one of these trips, and he's by himself. He's got his horses loaded with trade goods, I guess. Either trade goods or furs. And he runs into a band of Shawnee. The Shawnee come from Pennsylvania. He's interacting with Creek and Chickasaw and Choctaw, Cherokee, not so much with Shawnee. The Shawnee were down here because they were on a raid. So he's walking down this trail and here's the big group of them. Now he's got his rifle, maybe 2 rifles, I don't know. He's got a couple of pistols. He's ready to protect himself always. And he sees the leader of the group. They're kind of in single file. That's how they travel. And the first guy is startled when he sees a deer. And he starts talking to him in a very loud voice. And that's in order, some people, they'll do that to bolster their own courage, but also to sound threatening. And James Adair replies, he says, I'm an English Chickasaw. And then he looks back behind him and then looks ahead of him. The signal being there's people back there. And the Chickasaw, or the Shawnee, knew that they better not mess with him because an English Chickasaw means he's married to a Chickasaw woman, and the Chickasaw clan that he belongs to will come after them if they harm him. Because the Indian nation viewed that relationship with the trader as being very important. It gives them access to all these trade goods. And that's kind of, so, but it gives an indication of, he calls himself an English Chickasaw. Okay, next. Oh gosh, I've got half my slides to go. This is, I'll just go quickly. This is John Thompson Adair. He's a descendant of John Adair, who was a cousin of James Adair. And John Adair had a brother, Edward Adair, and they married Cherokee women. This is the grandson of John Adair, John Thompson Adair. He became the Chief Justice of the Cherokee Supreme Court. Did you know that they had institutions like that? That's why they're called one of the 5 civilized tribes. They tried to model their government in the early 1800s after the U.S. government. So he's the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and he says James Adair, the Indian trader, was the brother of his grandfather, John Adair and Edward Adair. Now, I think somebody that devotes their whole life to justice and truth is a credible source. And he's talking about his grandfather's brother. That's not very distant. But when you look at the dates, you can tell he can't be a brother. John Adair was born about 1750, 54, something like that. And James Adair was born about 1709. So it's obvious it's a close relationship. He thought they were brothers. They weren't brothers. There's another descendant of John Adair who says they were cousins. Okay? So you take it together and you say, okay, they're telling us something that is close. It's something you can probably rely on. Okay, next. So John Adair, his first wife was a Cherokee woman. She died after giving him, I can't remember, 6 or so children. And then John Adair married Jane Kilgore. I don't know if y'all are familiar with any Kilgores, but Jane Kilgore's father was Benjamin Kilgore. He was in the Revolutionary War. He was a captain. He was captured and had a kind of an exciting life. Benjamin Kilgore was the neighbor of our James Adair and Joseph Adair. So John Adair, who married the Cherokee woman first, and second married Jane Kilgore, his second wife he married was our neighbor, the neighbor of our ancestor. I mean, as I mentioned before, John Adair lived up in the corner of the state. So he came back down here and he married the neighbor of James Adair. I think that indicates the relationship that John Thompson Adair is describing. But so far, all we have is circumstantial evidence. I think when we found this record, this is, by the way, something we found. most of this is stuff we know. Message is good. Why would John Adair marry the neighbor of our ancestor unless our ancestor was James Adair, the Indian trader? Okay. Oh, do I have time for this? Can I go 10 more minutes, y'all?
Sure.
Is that okay? I'll try to speed it up. I just love this stuff. So we know Chinchokma, Iwachokma. The next one, Patak Apima Chia. It means, Patak is a person, Apima means Indian, and Chia is are you, something like that. So it's like, are you an Indian? That's what they say in Chickasaw. And the answer is, E Chikasha Saya. Yes, I am Chickasaw. And everyone here who's descended from James Adair Sr. can say, E Chikasha Saya. I'm going to show you why. Should I continue? Okay, next slide. Now you guys may not be able to see this or understand it. Lois and I, when we first started working on this stuff, it was like 10 years ago, we couldn't understand it. It's pretty straightforward though, if you think about it. So here we have James Adair Sr., Indian trader and author, James Adair Jr., James Adair III, and we have two lines, and we have two people here who contributed DNA, and their DNA is identical. These numbers represent the name of a branch of the DNA type. And so their two DNA types are identical. James Adair Jr. had a brother, Joseph Adair. He had a son named Thomas Adair, and those families moved to Utah. And these two men are descended from them, and their Y-DNA is identical to these two. So the records show these relationships, and the DNA confirms it. Okay? Now these people, these are all descendants of Joseph Adair Sr. And there were some changes in those lines. So you look up there and you see there's some differences in the numbers. What happens is random changes occur in the Y-DNA. And it usually occurs every 3, 4, 5 generations. Sometimes it goes 10 generations, no changes. Sometimes it goes 2 generations, a change, another 2 generations, a change. Each one of those changes represents a branch. So if you belong to a type of DNA that's a branch, it means you belong to that branch and you belong to the line above. Okay? So even though there's a couple of different types here, they're all subcategories of Joseph's DNA. And if you look at the DNA itself, you can tell that that type of DNA is a change from this type of DNA. Does that make sense so far?
Yeah.
So, I know, the point is, Joseph Adair Jr., when he was conceived, his DNA, his Y-DNA changed just a tiny bit. And what that means is that all of his male line descendants had that change. It's not a bad thing, it's just what it is. It's how we are. But you can tell that that change occurred in Joseph. And what that means is that, up here. That means that Joseph's father, who was the father of James Sr. and of Joseph, his DNA type was exactly the type that James, his was. It's not better or worse or anything else. All it is, it tells us, it confirms that Joseph Adair was the brother of James Adair. Okay, so you do the same thing. These are descendants of John Adair, who married the Cherokee woman. Their descendants live out in Oklahoma. They're members of the Cherokee Nation. Edward Adair, same thing, he married a Cherokee woman. And all of their DNA is identical. And it's a type of DNA that you can look at the relationship between their DNA and our DNA, and you can tell their father was a first cousin of our ancestor. So, skipping ahead, this Supreme Court Justice, he also said that his ancestor, John Adair, came back to America when James Adair published his book. So what happened was James Adair probably went to his hometown in Ireland, telling all of his relatives about his adventures here in America, and his two sons of his cousin said, I want to go too, that sounds like a lot of fun. They came back with him to America. They have this story that passed down in their family, and their DNA proves that they are sons of a cousin, first cousin of James Adair and Joseph Adair. It's all fitting together. This is William Adair's line. We tested two of his. He lived in Chester County, and from the records, James Barnett Adair said he thought that he was a brother. The DNA shows that he was a cousin. So, probably came from the same town in Ireland if we can figure out where that was. Okay. This is, I think, the last evidence. The signature on the Williams petition. The signature of our ancestor, James Adair, is in black. I don't know if you can see the red, but what we did was we found letters that the Indian traders wrote to various people, and we looked for his signature. And it was very difficult because a lot of times in the bottom corner, the copy of the letter was so faded you couldn't see the signature. So we had to look for where he said James somewhere else or Adair somewhere else in the letter. But the bottom line is we traced the red from James Adair, the Indian trader's letters, and then we superimposed that on the known signature of our ancestor, James Adair Sr. And I would say that they are exact. I'll point out a few things. The A, it kind of reminds me of a heart, a little heart. It's a little bit it's got a flat side, and it's a little bit like a triangle. It's a pretty distinct shape. The top of this letter, whose hand, writing their signature, makes the perfect shape over a period of time. This E is it's a form of a letter that people would make in the 1600s and the early 1700s, where they would draw the E like that, almost like like an R or something like that. James Adair in his letters, sometimes he made it that way, sometimes he made it the more normal way, which is the little loop. But when you take the instance where he signed his name, actually this is from James an instance where we were able to get the whole James. His letter is like that kind of a backwards E, like, I don't know how to describe it. But it's hard to see, but the black, our signature is exactly right. The S is the same shape. The A, same shape. This leg is just a little bit in. And then look at this. I mean, that is this D exactly. The R exactly. I mean, I have no doubt that proves that our ancestor James Adair was the Indian trader, especially when you look at all the other evidence. Okay, I'm done. This is the quote. Can y'all see that? I'll read it. I have the pleasure of writing this by the side of a Chickasaw female as great a princess as ever lived among the ancient Peruvians or Mexicans. And she bids me be sure not to mark the paper wrong after the manner of most of the traders. Otherwise it would spoil the making of good bread or hominy, and of course beget the ill will of our white women. The role that Eleanor plays in this story, I think, is so important. We wanted to try to bring that out from book, so I hope you can see that as well. Do y'all have any questions? I will wait over. I'm sorry. Yes.
So I read in the book that he spoke 8 languages. Were those mostly Native American?
I'm sorry?
He spoke 8 languages you mentioned in the book?
James Adair did?
Not that you mentioned that.
I don't remember that.
Cherokee, Chickasaw, he knew a little bit of Hebrew, he just Greek, probably.
Well, yeah, okay, I mean, now you've been mentioned, maybe I did. So he published articles. He was very driven to shape the discussions in society. He would take a position on this or that. And he would cite Latin authors. He does a lot with Hebrew in his book. And I thought, how in the world did he learn Hebrew? Now, James Barnett Adair says that James Adair Sr. and Joseph Adair Sr. were sons of a Thomas Adair, and that he gives names up. And that line is descended from some very well-educated Adairs who were very active in the Presbyterian movement in Northern Ireland. If James Adair is descended from that line, it would make sense that he would have received a good education. But one of the things that we want to try to discover is, by using this DNA, we could go to Ireland, find people with an Adair name, and test their DNA and figure out how they're related. We don't. Basically, what I'm saying is we don't know how he learned these languages. My suspicion is he probably had a pretty good education, but he was just very smart and he was driven. There were Jewish communities in South Carolina, and I think he communicated with a rabbi here. But the way he uses Hebrew in an analytical way, to me, suggests that he knew it a little better than somebody who just looked at a book or something. Anything else?
I have 2 things. One is, you could match up the DNA without the last name.
Yes.
With DNA.com, so you don't have to really do that.
Yes.
The earlier question would be, do you know the Chickasaw towns that he lived in?
Yes. In our book, we identify the town, the Chickasaw town that James Adair lived in. And this is another one of these, we don't have that in our book that other people don't have. The way we detected that, somebody mentioned to me they heard, so in our book we identified Eleanor's clan as the Panther clan. James Adair names the clans. The Indians, they had clans. The clans were the wives, it was the female that identified the clan. So when James Adair married Eleanor, he became a member of the Panther clan. The Panther clan was the clan that the chiefs of the tribe came from. And a chief was not selected by being the son of a previous chief. He was selected by being the son of a sister of the previous chief, or if he was a brother of the previous chief, he became the chief because he's a son of the mother of the previous chief. It always comes down through the female. So Indian traders tried to marry women who belonged to the clan that was the clan of the chiefs. So it makes perfect sense that he would marry a woman who was in the Panther clan, and that also explains why he referred to her as every bit of a princess. I'll say one thing. Why didn't James Adair Jr. and Joseph Adair move to Oklahoma when the Cherokee, Chickasaw, all the people were moving? I think it's because Eleanor was from that branch of the Chickasaw that had come to South Carolina. So she was born here. She wasn't born in Mississippi. She's living in this area. And during the Revolutionary War, most of those Chickasaw moved back to Mississippi. Well, she had raised her children here. She had lived her whole life here. I bet there was a conversation with her and James Adair. Do we stay here or do we go back? And they decided to stay here. At that point, their sons are not going to go, they're not going to say, hey, send me to Oklahoma too. The people who were part of the Cherokee Nation or Chickasaw or whatever, who were really assimilated with the tribe, and they were connected to the tribe in a deeper way, like John and Edward. Their sons did. Their Cherokee sons, they did go back to Oklahoma. Ours did not, and I think it's just because they had made a different choice. They were going to identify with the European community. Well, thank y'all for being so patient.